If something in your house knows your schedule better than you do, that's not coincidence. It's someone else making sure you're alone when they visit. If this were you, what would you do? Before I go into the full story, subscribe now to hear my stories again, and that's if you genuinely like what I do here. Turn on post notification too if you want to get notified when I send a gift your way. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now turn on the fan to have that soothing background hum while you listen. Story 1. The night I woke up because my bed sheet was folded over my face and no one was in the room. I realized I had been dreaming while something else was moving my body. If you've ever slept alone and felt your limbs move without you choosing it, listen, because I learned the hard way that sleep can belong to more than just you. I moved into a small rental after a messy breakup, the kind of place with cheap blinds and a radiator that hissed like an old kettle. Nights were my refuge. I would read for an hour until my eyes demanded sleep, then set my phone on the nightstand and let the room become nothing but the low sound of the fan and occasional traffic far down the street. For the first week it felt ordinary. I'd wake up at sunrise, make coffee, scroll for a few minutes, and go about my day. It felt safe in the way that the familiar always does. Predictably dull, gently boring. I liked that. I needed that. On the 8th night, around 3 in the morning, I woke with the taste of metal at the back of my throat. I lay still, thinking it was a dream residue, but then I realized something else felt wrong. The blanket was pulled tight over my head, folded just so, like someone had taken care to tuck it in. I reached up with one hand and the linen slid away as if it were being lifted by something that understood how I slept. I opened my eyes. The lamp was off. The window curtains were closed. I listened for an apartment door down the hall. Nothing. My mind offered the usual explanations. I had pulled the sheet down in a half-asleep fog. I sat up and the clock read 3:07. I remember thinking, somehow, that the room felt colder than the thermostat should allow. I shrugged it off and lay back down, telling myself I'd been restless. I hadn't yet realized the simplest mistake that invites the darkest things. Ignoring the first small proof that something else noticed you. Over the next few nights, I began to notice patterns. My shoes would be moved a few inches to the right. The light switch would be in a slightly different position. Once, the bedside glass of water was halfway drunk. Not spilled, but clearly tasted. Each small thing stacked until it stopped being coincidence. I set up a cheap motion light at the doorway, but the camera's little red light never blinked during the night. Instead, I started waking to a sensation of being observed before my eyes were open, like someone was standing at the foot of the bed, just outside where my blanket left a hollow. I developed tricks, leaving the TV on low, sleeping with the hall light dim, keeping my phone under my pillow. Those tricks felt juvenile, but they made me feel active, like I was doing something to reclaim the night. One morning I woke to find a hairline scratch along my forearm. It's the kind of mark you might make on a wall absent-mindedly. I went through my day uneasy but rational. A neighbor's cat, a stray nail. Night came and the air felt different, as if it held more attention than before. That night I dreamed of a face made of shadow leaning over me, watching as if it were trying to memorize the exact shape of my face. I woke because my legs had been pulled toward the edge of the bed. I know how that sounds, ridiculous, melodramatic. But the bedsheet was knotted in a way I had not done. I kept a small voice recorder after that, an old habit of mine when I wanted to catch a thunderstorm or a dog barking. I left it on the nightstand and told myself I would finally get evidence of some prankster. When I listened back in the morning, the recording was mostly silence with a low creak at 2:42 a.m. and then, at 3:06, a soft sound like fabric being smoothed. Then the file cut off as if the recorder had been picked up and set down quickly. There was no explanation. False relief would come in the daylight. I would convince myself that my brain was inventing patterns out of boredom, and life would pull me away. The mundane demands of work, the occasional friend calling, the grocery list. They were sunlight that made the room ordinary again. But every evening the same hesitation returned as I walked through the doorway. A memory of something having taken care to learn my sleeping rhythm. For weeks, the intrusions were small. Then came a night when the presence did something that stopped my attempts at reasoning cold. I woke to a hand, not imagined, not a tingling, pressing very lightly against my wrist. It was not rough or warm. It held a neutral weight like someone testing whether I was still there. My eyes flew open. The room was pitch black, darker than the curtains should have allowed. I flipped the lamp on and nothing in the room matched what I had felt. No footprints on the floor, no movement in the curtains, no sign that someone had even breathed inside the apartment. My wrist bore a faint, fingertip-colored crescent. I laughed at myself then, the desperate laugh of someone who knows they're about to lose credibility if they tell the truth. I rubbed my wrist and told myself to sleep in a chair, to stay awake all night, to call someone. I tried all of it. The next night, I decided on proof. I ran a $30 camera on a tripod, pointed at the bed, set to record. I taped an index card to the corner of my blanket with the words I would know if moved, and then I went to bed with the light on until I forced myself to switch it off. I woke at 3, but not because of any weight. I woke because I felt like my body was drifting, not awake but not asleep either, as if I were a passenger sliding away from control. I tried to fight, to will my fingers to move, and my left hand rose a fraction of an inch before the fingers curled inward like a glove being closed. I felt movement, not through sight, but through a deep internal pressure, and then the index card was folded neatly, the corner tucked under the pillow as if to crease it out of habit. I screamed then, a short, raw sound I had not meant to make, and the presence withdrew like a tide. I switched the lamp on and there it was, the index card folded. The camera, when I checked it, had footage that showed a small change in light, a shadow, and then a 3-second gap of static before the recording resumed. The time code jumped from 2:59 straight to 3:07 with no explanation. That gap was a hole I could not fill with logic. I sent the clip to a friend who believes in the rational and she texted back a shrug emoji and a gif. That silence was worse than any disbelief. I moved out 2 weeks later, though I told myself I was doing it because the landlord raised the rent. In truth, I could not bear the idea of being rehearsed for sleep by something that wanted to know how I breathed. I packed boxes while thinking that daylight would anonymize experience. The moving truck came at noon, and by evening my bed was in an unfamiliar room that smelled faintly of paint and promise. I set up the sheets, placed the motion sensor in the corner, and slept with a different kind of exhaustion. The kind that comes from trying to outpace memory. For 3 nights, nothing unusual happened. I allowed myself to relax, to believe that the pattern had ended and that a life unresearched by strange hands was possible. On the 4th night, I began to wake at 3. It was involuntary at first, the kind of alarm clock waking that fits no time zone. I opened my eyes and the sheet had been folded over the foot of the bed in the exact manner I had taught myself to fold it when I was a child. A fold I hadn't used since my mother taught me. On the nightstand, among the boxes, someone had left a small, smooth pebble I did not own, gray and warm as if held for a long time and left behind. I picked it up and found, under the pebble, a hair. Not mine, not from anyone I knew. Tucked into the wood like a secret signature. The hair was dark and fine. I never found out whose it was. Now when I sleep I do so with one eye open and a bag packed by the door. I keep the fan on, just like I told you to, because that low hum covers the smallest sounds that might mean something else is learning the layout. I have accepted that some nights will have visitors, invisible and careful. I do not expect an explanation. Sometimes I wake feeling folded and ordinary items rearranged and I tell myself the place was always like that I am remembering wrong. But then, once every few weeks, I wake to the same soft pressure at my wrist and the same taste of metal. The pebble remains where I left it on the nightstand. A small, impossible fossil of proof that whatever brushed my life wasn't only a dream. Would you have folded the blanket back over you and pretended it never happened? Or would you have moved out the first morning? Tell me what you would have done. Do you believe something else can take care of the nights while you sleep? Or is this just overload from loneliness? Comment below if you've ever found something in your room you didn't own. If you want, I can show you the short clip with the gap. Would you watch it or walk away? Story 2. The first time I saw him, I thought it was a dream. The kind of dream you wake from sweating, heart racing, and swear you'll forget by morning. But I didn't forget, because when I opened my eyes, the figure was still there. Standing, waiting, inches from where I slept. People tell you shadows aren't dangerous. that they're tricks of the light. But no one prepares you for when the shadow watches you back. I'd been living alone for only a few months, adjusting to the stillness of a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. My days were quiet: commute, work, dinner, and hours of scrolling until my eyes blurred. Nights were supposed to be calmer, and they usually were. I liked falling asleep with a small lamp glowing, the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen, and the faint rumble of cars on the highway. The space felt safe enough. I told myself the loneliness was a price worth paying for peace. By the third week, I was finally starting to rest properly, sinking into sleep without tossing and turning. One night, around 2:30, I stirred from sleep with the unsettling sense that something was slightly off. Not wrong, not terrifying, just different. The room felt thicker somehow, the kind of thickness you notice after someone's been in it a while, leaving their scent and weight behind. My lamp was still on, the faint yellow glow stretching across the carpet. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I saw it. The corner of the room seemed darker than usual, not because of shadows, but because something stood there. A figure, still, silent, tall enough that its head brushed the ceiling. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't part of the furniture either. I blinked several times, telling myself I was dreaming with my eyes open, but when I turned my face away and back again, it hadn't changed. It was there, watching. The following nights became a slow unraveling. At first, I convinced myself I had simply been half asleep, trapped between dream and wakefulness. But then it happened again, always at roughly the same hour. I would wake without reason, turn toward the lamp, and see him. He didn't move closer, didn't raise a hand, didn't vanish. He only stood, his form cut clean against the wall, darker than the rest of the room, as if he absorbed light rather than cast it. Sometimes he was closer to the foot of the bed, other times beside the wardrobe. But he was always there, tall and patient. I even tested myself. Left my glasses on the nightstand, removed them, put them back on. Nothing changed. He was always visible. Once, I thought it was a trick of exhaustion, so I slept in the living room on the couch. At 3, I woke, rolled over, and found him standing in the doorway, body tilting slightly forward, as though curious about my change of scenery. The escalation came quietly. I noticed small shifts, the blanket tugging slightly at my feet, the sound of fabric creasing as if someone leaned against the bed frame, the faintest pressure on the mattress like weight settling without form. I tried talking to it once, my voice shaky, asking, "Who are you?" The silence afterward felt heavier than any answer could have been. By then, I had stopped sleeping deeply. I would drift, hover, wake again, every hour or so, my body buzzing with the anticipation of opening my eyes and finding him closer. Sometimes, I thought I saw the suggestion of arms or a head tilt, as though his patience was wearing thin. One night, I woke abruptly, the lamp flickering slightly as though the bulb couldn't decide whether to work. The shadow stood directly beside the bed, his outline so near I could make out the uneven edges of his form. I lay completely still, afraid to acknowledge him but unable to shut my eyes. Then came the smallest movement. His head bent down as if lowering toward me. Not fast, not violent, just steady. I smelled something faint, metallic, sharp in the air. My breath caught, and then the lamp went out with a soft click. Darkness swallowed the room whole. I reached for my phone, my hand trembling, but when I switched the flashlight on, the space beside me was empty. Only the smell lingered, hanging in the stillness. For a while, I thought the climax had passed, that whatever I had seen was satisfied with scaring me nearly out of my mind. But the truth revealed itself the next evening. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom. The door cracked open, when I caught sight of movement in the mirror. Not behind me, beside me. He stood reflected there, closer than he had ever been, his head tilted low as though studying my reflection. I spun, mouth still full of toothpaste, but the bathroom was empty. The mirror, however, still carried his outline. I smashed it with the heel of my hand, cutting my skin, but I didn't care. Shards fell into the sink, each one reflecting fragments of his figure, until the floor glittered with dozens of tiny shadows. After that, the visits changed. He no longer waited for me to wake at 3. Now, I would catch glimpses at random hours. His silhouette slipping past the hallway, his shape pressed against the window though I lived on the 3rd floor, his head lowering in the dark screen of my turned-off television. I realized then that he wasn't just standing, he was following. The bed had been his starting point, but he had learned the rest of my space. When I tell people this, they always ask why I haven't moved. The truth is, I did. Twice. New apartments, different cities, different layouts. And yet, every time he finds me, the shape beside the bed, the dark figure refusing to vanish, always watching, always waiting. Sometimes, I wonder if the first time I saw him, he wasn't introducing himself but claiming me. So I'll ask you, if you opened your eyes and saw a shadow taller than any person could be, standing so close you could hear its breathless patience, what would you do? Do you think it's safer to close your eyes and pretend it isn't there? Or would you stare back and wait for it to move first? Tell me, because tonight, I know I'll see him again. Story 3. I used to believe nothing good ever happened after midnight, but I was wrong. Midnight is harmless compared to 3 in the morning. That's the hour when time feels bent, when your body wakes for no reason, and when you realize you're not alone. They call it the witching hour, and I used to laugh at that. Until one night, when I opened my eyes and saw something sitting at the edge of my bed that I couldn't explain, and I haven't truly slept since. I've always been a light sleeper. Small creaks in the walls or the distant hum of traffic could pull me from even the deepest rest. My apartment was nothing unusual. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a thin carpet with a pattern that looked like it had lived through decades. Nights had their rhythm. Scrolling through my phone until my eyelids sagged, drifting to the background murmur of the fan, and waking naturally with the morning light filtering through the blinds. It was routine, safe, predictable. For months, I had no reason to suspect the hour between 2 and 4 was anything more than quiet time for the city to reset. Then came the night I woke suddenly, with no sound to explain it. My eyes drifted to the clock on the nightstand. The glowing numbers read 3 o'clock. Exactly. My body felt alert, though I had no reason to be. I listened carefully, searching for a noise from the hallway, a car outside, anything that would explain it. But the building was silent, the kind of silence that presses too hard on the ears. I sighed, turned over, and pulled the blanket higher. That's when I noticed something at the corner of the room, near the chair where I usually tossed my jacket. A shape too large to be clothing, too still to be furniture. I blinked, sat up slightly, and stared. It looked like someone was sitting there, bent forward slightly, head low. I froze. After a long minute, I convinced myself it was the jacket draped at an odd angle. I even got up, switched on the lamp, and laughed nervously at my own imagination. The chair was empty, just fabric and folds. But when I switched the light off again and slipped back into bed, the shape returned. Same spot, same posture. Over the next week, the pattern grew stranger. Always at 3, I would wake. Sometimes the shape appeared in the chair, other times standing just at the doorway, blocking the dim outline of the hall. On one night, I saw what looked like a hand pressed against the wall, long and too thin, fingers spread wide as though it were testing the paint. Each time I told myself it was a trick of my tired eyes. But the waking was not random. I'd never been one to rouse at the same minute each night. 3 o'clock began to feel like an appointment. I tried to break it. I went to bed earlier, later, even stayed up until 4. No matter what, I found myself jolting awake at 3. The escalation came one Thursday morning. I opened my eyes and the shape wasn't across the room this time. It was at the edge of the bed. I could see the blanket dipping, the mattress shifting slightly under a weight that wasn't mine. I held my breath, terrified of moving, certain that if I acknowledged it, whatever sat there would lean closer. The room smelled faintly different too, like earth after rain, damp and metallic. I turned toward the wall, shut my eyes, and waited. When I finally dared to look again, the blanket had smoothed, but the indent remained. I couldn't explain it. Another night, I decided to record myself. I left my phone propped against a book, set to capture video through the dim glow of the lamp. The next morning, my stomach dropped when I checked. At 2:59, the footage showed me sleeping normally. At exactly 3 o'clock, the picture warped, a shadow passing across the lens, as if someone had leaned directly in front of it. The distortion lasted only 3 seconds, but it was enough to prove I wasn't imagining it. Worse still, when the camera steadied, I saw the chair across the room was occupied by a dark outline. The shape turned its head slightly, though there were no features to see, only blackness. The recording cut out right after that. Things only spiraled from there. Sometimes I'd wake to the sound of whispering, soft and layered, though I could never make out the words. Sometimes it was tapping, 3 slow knocks against the wall by my bed. I began dreading sleep, dragging out evenings with movies and music, anything to delay the inevitable. But even when I stayed awake, at 3 the atmosphere of the room changed. Lights flickered, objects shifted. Once, the fan slowed, even though it was still plugged in and running. Another time, my phone battery drained from 70% to 0 in an instant. The worst moment came when I finally worked up the courage to confront it. I woke at 3 again, the shape waiting at the doorframe. My body shook, but I forced my voice out. "What do you want?" I whispered. The silence that followed stretched until it hurt. And then, slowly, the shape stepped forward. Not walking, not gliding, something in between, like it existed in frames rather than fluid motion. Closer, closer. It stopped at the edge of the bed, inches from me, and though it had no eyes, I knew it was staring. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. Then I felt it. An invisible hand brushing my blanket, tugging once, almost gently, and then it was gone. For a few days afterward, nothing happened. I thought maybe it was over, that the confrontation had broken whatever cycle I'd been trapped in. But on the 5th night, I woke at 3 again. This time, the shape wasn't at the chair or the doorway or the edge of the bed. It was lying beside me under the blanket, its form pressed against mine as though it had always belonged there. The cold weight against my side was unbearable. I bolted upright, threw the blanket off the bed, and nothing was there. But the sheets were indented, and the smell of damp earth filled the room. That was the night I stopped pretending. I don't know what I saw, or why 3 o'clock chose me. I only know that when the clock blinks that time now, I don't fight it. I wait, eyes open, body rigid, wondering what shape I'll see and how much closer it will come. So tell me, if you woke at 3 every night to see someone sitting at the edge of your bed, would you ignore it? Or would you leave the house and never come back? Do you think 3 in the morning is just coincidence? Or is it the hour when something else decides to visit? Comment and let me know what you believe, because I know what I've seen, and I can't explain it. Story 4. The night I dreamed that the mailbox at the end of my street would be empty and woke to find it overturned and cracked open on the curb, I realized sleep had stopped being private. If a nightmare can rearrange the small facts of your life by morning, what does that make the person having the dream? For years, I treated bad dreams like a minor inconvenience. A jolt that left me sweating for a moment, a loaded memory I could shrug off with coffee. My life was the kind that prefers daylight. Work, errands, the kind of friendships that text rather than knock, weekends filled with chores rather than risk. Nights were for rest and the occasional silly dream about missing a test I'd already passed years ago. I lived in a quiet subdivision where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. The sort of place where people left their doors unlocked and knew each other's names. That ordinary backdrop made everything feel secure. I liked routine because it was predictable. It reassured me that life would not surprise me in cruel ways. The first unusual dream was small and strange. I was standing in my kitchen, bare feet on the tile, and the window over the sink was open despite the weather forecast predicting rain. A single paper plane sat on the counter where I normally left my bills. I picked it up and saw a tiny date written on the corner, the next day's date. I unfolded the paper and found a sentence I did not recognize, but it felt urgent. Don't try to find it. I woke up with the line still sitting in my mind and dismissed it as the nonsense of sleep. I checked the mailbox out of habit that afternoon and found nothing. Life continued, and I thought the dream was the kind of nothing that dreams often are. Then, a week later, I dreamed a vivid, terrible thing. A face appearing in the bedroom window, pressed close enough that the breath fogged the glass even though it wasn't cold. In the dream, the face was expressionless but focused, like a study in patience. I woke gasping, heart loud, and laughed the nervous laugh of someone embarrassed by their body's reaction. That night, I closed the curtains and locked the doors. The next morning, I found the living room window cracked open a half-inch and a smudge of something dark on the outside glass exactly where the face in the dream had been. My rational brain searched for an explanation. A raccoon? A child playing? But the mark did not fit anything I could imagine, like a fingerprint pressed by a hand wearing no glove. After that, the dreams moved from odd coincidence to pattern. Small, mundane things that I had seen in dreams appeared in waking life with uncanny accuracy. I dreamed of a bluebird nesting in the gutter. The next day, a small piece of blue plastic twisted into a bird shape clung there. I dreamed of my front porch light blinking 3 times in a row. When I checked my phone later, there was a utility bill notification stamped with 3 blinking emojis, absurd and precise. Each time, the dreams felt less random and more like messages someone else had written using my sleep as a medium. I tried to keep a dream journal, partly to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind, but the pages began to feel like a ledger of things that later arrived. Small, impossible coincidences that added up. The first major disturbance happened on a cool autumn night when my sleep slipped into the kind of depth that makes you certain waking will not be enough. In the dream, I walked down a corridor that ran through a house I didn't recognize, and at the end of the hallway, there was a door I had never seen in my life. When I opened it, I found a small room lined with clocks. Every one of them stopped at the same time, 3:13. Taped to the center clock was a Polaroid of me in my kitchen, taken from the angle of the window. I remember thinking, in the dream, that someone had been watching the parts of my life I assumed private. I woke with a kind of slow dread that settled in my limbs. That afternoon, a neighbor knocked to ask if I had seen a stray camera found on the curb. He handed me the Polaroid from his pocket. The image showed my kitchen at night, the exact view from my window, and a white date stamped at the bottom. The night before. The camera was a cheap model, weathered, and strange to find in a suburban lane. There were no prints on the box, no clues besides the photograph that proved someone had been there. The coincidence was so precise that I could not claim coincidence anymore. It felt like a trail leading directly back to me. Once the dreams began to leak into daylight, my nights were no longer safe. They started with small things, sounds from the ceiling that matched the creaks I had heard in dreams, a neighbor's dog barking in the exact cadence I had heard while asleep, and escalated into sequences that left me scrambling for an explanation. Dreams about missed exits became real traffic jams that forced me to take the same deserted back road 3 days in a row. Dreams about a specific song playing at a certain hour coincided with a neighbor's radio picking up an old station and broadcasting that same song at dawn. The world felt rigged, tuned to the pitch of whatever restless landscape I had wandered through while my eyelids fluttered. The escalation deepened in a way that robbed me of any remaining ease. One night I dreamed that I would receive a phone call from someone calling themselves hello, and the call would contain one line repeated over and over until I hung up. The line was a name I had not heard since childhood, and in the dream the voice on the other end said it with the warmth of someone who meant to cause no harm. I woke shaken and left my phone on the nightstand, feeling foolish but unable to sleep. At 3:12 a.m., my phone lit with an unknown number. The call lasted exactly 5 seconds. When I checked the missed calls, the number had been replaced by silence. The voicemail left behind was a thin, slightly garbled whisper of the same name. I replayed it until the sound became a shadow of memory, and then I realized the voice on the recording was not mobile or automated. It had the peculiar cadence of someone standing in a hallway, a soft shuffle of feet in the background, and then a pause as if waiting for something. The climactic night arrived without fanfare, as is often the way with the worst things. I dreamt that the living room would be full of people, or rather shapes of people, crowded silently around the couch where I slept. Their faces turned toward me like an audience waiting for an announcement. None of them spoke. Their presence was a kind of concentrated attention. In the dream, the air felt thick with expectation, and I woke before the moment of revelation. Heart thudding, palms slick. I switched on the lamp and sat upright, telling myself I had to be in control of my waking life. I checked the window, the lock, and the hallway. Everything appeared ordinary. Then I heard the sound. At first a susurrus at the edge of hearing, then the unmistakable rustle of movement gathered near the living room. I froze, waiting for the rational explanation. A late-night passerby, the building's heating system acting up, but the sound was not mechanical. It carried rhythm, like footsteps in a crowd measured in miniature. I crept toward the doorway and peered into the living room. The space was arranged exactly as it had been in my dream. The couch sagged with impressions of bodies. The air carried the faint smell of perfume and damp coats, and the television screen showed nothing but static. There were no people there, only the evidence of their presence, as if someone had momentarily paused a frame of life and left it sitting. I have never been good at resolving things. I do not have the bravado some people possess when confronted with the unknown. That night, I opened the front door and stepped into the hallway. The floor was warm beneath my feet. I thought of the faces I had imagined and wondered whether they were waiting for me to leave, expecting me to fill the empty center of the room with my reaction. I closed the door and went back to bed, though sleep now felt like walking through a minefield. The resolution, when it came, was not a tidy one. I cannot say the dreams stopped, or that the things they predicted ceased to manifest. Instead, they blurred further into my life. A recurring sentence appearing in grocery lists, a smell from a dream returning as someone else's cigarette outside my window. A small, persistent truth settled into me, that the boundary between sleeping and waking had thinned, allowing a kind of exchange I did not understand. I began to treat dreams like warnings or invitations, depending on the content. I started leaving notes to myself on the kitchen counter written in the present tense, reminders not to act on whatever the dream suggested. Sometimes the notes worked. Sometimes the dreams overrode them. Now, when I go to bed, I do so with a ritual. I lock the window twice, place my phone face down, and write a single line on a scrap of paper. This is not for you. I tuck it under my pillow in a small, defiant heap. It is a gesture of control as much as superstition, a paper talisman against whatever overheard me sleeping and decided to rearrange the days. Some nights it helps. Other nights nothing helps, and I wake to find some tiny, dream-shaped artifact on my doorstep. A single blue feather, a paper plane, a smear on the glass, as if sleep had delivered a postcard from another agency. Would you treat a nightmare as a private threat? Or would you start leaving notes to yourself and checking the corners of your life for evidence? Do you think sleep could be used against us? Or am I reading patterns into ordinary happenstance? Tell me what you would do, because I can't tell you whether the mail of my dreams will ever stop arriving. Story 5. If someone was crying outside your window every night for a week and you opened the curtains once and saw no one, would you keep the curtains closed and pretend you never heard her? I didn't, and what I learned in the dark taught me that some tears are left as warnings, not for comfort. I'd always taken comfort in the little rituals of my apartment. The way the streetlight painted a band of gold across the hardwood floor, the mattress that had finally conformed to my shape after years of sleeping on worse, the pale curtains I'd left when I moved in because they blurred the outside world without hiding it completely. Nights were ordinary, warm tea, a book, or a show, the fan set to the low hum I liked. I lived on the second floor of a short building with a stoop where people sometimes paused on their way home. It was the kind of place where a neighbor might hand over a parcel with a smile, not the kind of place where strangers lingered after midnight. So when I first heard the crying, I assumed it was someone passing by, ordinary grief spilling into the street, the kind you hear in cities and forget by morning. The first night I heard her, it was soft and far away, a broken sound threaded with the hush of late hours. I stood at the window and looked down into the street. Nothing. No silhouette under the lamplight, no coat flapping, no form at the edge of the curb where the sound seemed to come from. I shrugged it off as distance playing tricks on me and went back to the sofa. The sound returned the next night. Same low weeping, as if someone had a hand pressed to their mouth. And again I found no one outside. By the third night, the crying had a rhythm I recognized from old phone calls. Starts, falters, a long intake, then more quiet. It felt urgent in a way that made me put my ear to the glass and listen until the pains grew cold beneath my cheek. After a few nights, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Always between 2 and 3 o'clock, the crying began. I started checking every time, switching the lamp on beneath me to flood the street with light, but the stoop remained empty. Once, while standing with the curtain parting in my hand, I saw wet marks on the pavement glimmer where there should have been none, like the outline of steps someone had just taken. The marks vanished under the sodium streetlight as though they had never been. I began to keep a notebook beside the bed, writing down each hour and description of the sound, trying to map something that had no map. The first disturbance that made me change my routine happened when I opened the window to shout down, "Hey, are you okay?" My voice felt too loud and childish in the night. The crying stopped mid-sob, and for the first time all week I heard a response that wasn't merely sound. A whisper floated upward, so faint I almost convinced myself it hadn't existed. "Leave it closed." I stared into the darkness until my throat tightened. The rational part of me argued that the wind must have pulled the syllables from somewhere, but the way the whisper folded into the night felt deliberate, like someone who wanted me to understand without revealing themselves. I stopped opening the window after that. Instead, I set an old recorder on the sill and left the curtain cracked an inch so whatever visitor there was could not see me if they looked up. The tape captured nothing for several nights but for static and, once, the distant rumble of a late truck. Then, at 2:58 a.m., a pattern of sobs rose into the microphone and the recording caught something else. Soft footsteps on the pavement below, measured and careful, followed by a dragging sound. The audio itself went thin and almost brittle at the moment the footsteps passed under my building, like a sound that had been stretched across space. When I played it back in the daylight, the waveform showed a clear spike at the moment the dragging began, but there was no visible reporter or object on the street that could have caused such a noise. The escalation was small at first but impossible to ignore. The crying grew closer in tone, almost in timbre, like someone learning where the sound carried best and adjusting. On the night, it changed into a plea. I woke to a damp spot at the base of my window where condensation shouldn't have been. It was a ring of cold, as if someone had pressed a palm flat to the glass. My breath left me slow and ragged. I pressed my hand against the mark and felt nothing but the chill of the pain. After that, the sound would sometimes move along the wall outside my bedroom, shifting its location as if the person making it had decided to stand beneath a different window. I lay awake, counting the seconds between sobs and the beat of my own pulse, wanting proof but afraid of what proof would look like. One night, emboldened by fear rather than courage, I opened the curtains fully and leaned out the window, head and shoulders over the sill, calling down quietly, "Who are you?" The air smelled of jasmine and trash, summer compressed into one wet breath. For a moment there was silence I could measure with a clock. Then the edge of the stoop moved, a foot appearing from the dark. It was bare and pale, as though the person wore no shoes, and it left a wet crescent on the concrete. I almost reached out before something in me stopped. When I pulled back, I saw no face, no arm, just the trace where a body had been. The window glass was wet in a perfect oval where someone had leaned and wept. My rational mind catalogued possibilities. Bleeding, a prank, someone who'd had their mind wrecked by drink. But the way the night resisted explanation built a pressure that felt like it could displace a city block. The climax came without bells. One night, I woke to silence that was too tight to be empty. I slid open the curtains, and for the first time there she was in full view, standing under the thinnest sliver of moonlight near the lamppost. Her dress was long and soaked, hair plastered to her face, shoulders trembling. She looked like someone who had been walking for hours. Not far from her, the air shimmered as if it were warmer closer to the street, and the woman's outline seemed slightly out of sync with the world, like a film played at the wrong frame rate. She lifted her face toward the windows as if searching for a house and stopped when her eyes found mine. They were empty in a way I can't describe without losing the detail. No iris, no whites, just depth. She started toward my building slowly, and with every step there was a ripple on the pavement like someone dragging a wet cloth. I backed away and something inside me imploded. She turned her head as if listening for the sound of my retreat, then tapped once on the base of the window with a damp finger. The sound echoed into me more than the night around it. I did the only thing that felt possible. I opened the door and slipped onto the landing, one floor below, and watched her pace beneath me as if performing a ritual. She walked the length of the block twice, stopped each time at a stoop, and then always, with the same deliberate gentleness, she looked up at the windows as if testing which houses would answer. Around her, the night smelled of old perfume and the subway. Sometimes she lifted her hands to her face and stifled a sob. Sometimes she cupped her palms and put them over her ears, as if she could close the world out with touch. At one point she reached up and tapped the stone over my door 3 slow, soft raps, then began to walk away into nothing. After that night, the visits changed. The woman no longer stayed outside my window every night. She began to move. Some nights I would see her at a corner 3 blocks away, standing very still and turning her head slowly as if listening for a signal. Other nights she would appear across the street, reflected in a neighbor's darkened window, always out of reach. I tried to follow her once at a distance, but when I rounded the far corner she was gone, and only a pair of wet footprints led toward an alley that ended in a blank wall. No one claimed to have seen her in daylight. No search turned up a missing person report that matched the description. It was as if her existence preferred shadow. The twisted resolution is that I learned to live with the sound. Sometimes I keep the curtains closed and pretend I do not know the tune of her sobbing. Other nights I sit at the sill and let the sound wash over me until it drains out like a tide. I leave a candle on the windowsill during the worst weeks, a small human rebellion against whatever wants to be heard and doesn't want to speak. Once, I left a note on the stoop in the hope she would find it. If you need help, come to the light by the deli at noon. The next morning there was a small, round pebble on top of it, warm as if held in a palm for a long time. Would you have put a note on the stoop? Would you have called someone? Or kept the curtains closed and pretended you never heard the crying? Tell me what you would do, and if you've ever woken to someone calling from outside your room, say where you were and what time it was. Story 6. I picked up the phone and heard my best friend laughing like nothing had happened, even though he'd been dead for 6 months. If someone you loved called you from beyond the grave and said, "I'm okay," would you tell anyone? Or keep it secret like I did? We grew up sending stupid memes at 2 in the morning and trading playlists like they were treasure. He was the kind of friend who always answered, no matter how late, with a voice that made everything feel less heavy. After he died in that accident, nights were the worst. Everyone else moved on. Family, mutual friends, the funeral, the flowers. For me, quiet hours were full of memory. The playlist we shared, the jokes he'd send, the way our phones would buzz in sync when a new song dropped. I slept with my phone on the nightstand because it felt wrong to let it be out of reach. I told myself it was comfort. I told myself it stopped being dangerous. It was a rainy Thursday. I woke up at 3:19 a.m. to my phone light blinking on the charger. A number I didn't recognize flashed the screen, but the contact name that popped up made me drop the phone like it burned me. His name. The text preview showed nothing, just that the call was incoming. I stared at the screen thinking maybe my fingers had hit something in my sleep, but the phone vibrated again, louder, insistent. I answered with a shaky hello, and his laugh cut through the line like it had always done. It was real, the exact cadence, the tiny sound at the end of certain words when he was trying not to laugh too loud. I said his name before I stopped myself, and he said, casually, "Hey, you awake?" My first thought was that someone had made a really cruel joke. My second thought was that grief was playing tricks on me. I told myself to hang up, to call someone, to delete the call log. Instead, I kept talking. We talked like normal people do at 2 in the morning. About nothing, about the weather, a stupid series we both hated. He asked what I was doing, and I told a half-truth. Reading, mostly trying to sleep. He then said something that froze the small warmth I felt. "Do you remember the last place we hid the mixtape?" He used the nickname we'd given it when we were 16. I stammered, because who would ask about a mixtape at 3 a.m.? He insisted, and his voice sounded like it was right next to me, not on a speaker. I walked to the closet, chest tight, and opened the shoebox where he'd helped me hide old junk years ago. The tape was there exactly where my memory kept it, wrapped in a napkin I knew I'd never use. The call stayed open while I fumbled. I held the phone above the box and asked, "How do you know?" He laughed, a short sound, and said, "You always put it there. Duh." I told myself then that I needed proof. I recorded the call with a second device, hands shaking. My voice was thin when I asked him where he was. He answered with a street name I recognized from our childhood, the alley behind the bakery where we used to skateboard. I told him there was no reason he could be there. He said, "I told you I'm okay." That line hit me harder than anything. Days passed and the calls continued. Sometimes they were short, a minute or two of small talk. Sometimes they were long and wandering like he was alone and had a lot to say. He could tell me things only we knew. A stupid secret handshake, the hidden part of the park bench where we carved our initials. He'd refer to small things from the funeral that only a handful of people knew about, like the ribbon color on the program. I started to sleep less, waiting for the phone to light up. I told myself it was a scam or a hacker or someone who knew how to mimic voices. I loaded audio of his old voicemails and compared tones, pitch, inflection. The recordings matched too well. At night, I'd press the spectral replay button and listen to his laugh and then the current call and try to find the seam where a trick might be visible. Couldn't. One night, the call lasted until nearly dawn. He described things in detail that couldn't be coincidence. The exact scrape on the bench, the way the bakery's neon buzzes on rainy nights, the smell of the alley when someone left a candle burning. His voice changed in ways that made my skin feel thin. Sometimes it sounded like him, present and warm. Other times it was layered, as if two voices were speaking at the same time, the regular cadence over a low undercurrent. He told me a story about going back to the lake we used to skip stones in. He said he walked along the bank and found something there, something he felt he needed to tell me about. I asked him what, and for the first time in months he got quiet. The quiet lasted too long. My throat closed up. Finally he said, "You have to stop looking for me in the places that used to be ours." His words were soft, and they fit like a hand on a wound. I asked why, because I was too stubborn to let go, and he answered, "I don't want you to get stuck." The call dropped then. No static, no goodbye, just the line going dead like someone had cut the string of a balloon midair. That night I couldn't sleep. I went to the alley behind the bakery, the one he had described. Rain slicked the pavement and the alley smelled like old paper and damp wood. I stood there until my legs ached, looking for a sign, some proof that someone had been there. There was nothing but the normal detritus of a city. A crushed takeout box, a lost shoe, a faded flyer. I sat on the curb and scrolled through the calls again. I found a voicemail I'd saved, one of his older ones, and played it with the rain drowning the edges. Then my phone buzzed. The new call was from the same unknown number. I answered with my voice small. He said clearly, "Don't come looking." The voice sounded different. It echoed like he spoke from a place with walls that weren't mine. Behind him there was noise. A low tide, a rush of something like wind through tall grass, or a crowd at a distance. The sound made me want to run. I hung up and could not tell if I had ever actually heard him speak those words or if my mind had stitched them together from fear. The line was both proof and cruelty. After weeks of calls that alternated between comfort and cruelty, I did something small and ridiculous. I mailed him a letter. I wrote about the mixtape, the stupid handshake, the time we stole candy and blamed the dog. I told him how much I missed him and how I hated that he was gone. I put the letter in an envelope, addressed it to his family with a note. "If this is from you, tell me." The reply was a short text from his sister the next day. She hadn't called me. She didn't know about any calls, and the family phone logs showed no outgoing number at those times. She offered to check old voicemails, nothing new there either. I sat with that silence like a stone in my mouth. The calls kept coming, more sporadic, more cryptic. He began to say things about my apartment like the color of the paint in the hallway, the cat I borrowed last month, even the odd pattern of bruises on my elbow from when I fell. Once, during a long call, he asked me to do something trivial. Leave a light on in the kitchen for a week. When I asked why, he said simply, "So I know you're there." I did it because what else was there to do? Felt like paying a toll to a ghost. Nights stretched into a routine of waiting and listening and then replaying. Friends told me to block the number, to call the police, to talk to someone professional. I tried all of it. I blocked the number and a new one replaced it within days. I filed a police report. The detective was kind but blunt. Without a traceable line or a recording showing a crime, there was little they could do. I went to a counselor who suggested grief counseling, sleep hygiene, even replacing my phone. They called it a symptom. I called it a mystery. Now, months later, the calls are rare. Sometimes I get a text with one of the old jokes we used to send, and I can feel the ghost of a laugh in my chest. Sometimes I hear his voice in a dream, but even dreams have changed now. They come with a thin, echoing layer beneath them, as if someone else is standing at the back of the scene watching. I still sleep with my phone on the nightstand, even though it brings both comfort and dread. I save the recordings and listen to them in daylight like a ritual, proof that he existed and hate that he's not here anymore. Would you pick up if someone you loved called from a number that shouldn't exist? Would you tell your friends or keep it to yourself like I did? Tell me what you would do, and if you've ever had a call that didn't make sense at 3 in the morning, say where you were and what happened. Story 7. The night I felt something move above my bed and woke to find tiny, perfect circles pressed into the plaster. I realized the ceiling wasn't just a roof. It was an animal timeline I couldn't read. If you've ever been sure a sound came from a place that should be empty, listen to this and tell me what you do. I lived alone in a narrow apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place where the building hum never truly stopped. Nights usually meant one thing for me: quiet movies I'd half watch on my laptop, a bowl of cereal that doubled as dinner, and the old fan that rattled like a second heartbeat. I liked sleeping with the blinds cracked because the street lamps drew long, lazy shapes across my walls, and I liked the way the room smelled like the beginning of summer when someone 2 floors down opened their window. It felt safe enough, ordinary noises that belonged to the building rather than to anything personal. I had a small routine: brush my teeth, lay out clothes for the next day, leave a glass of water on the nightstand. It was simple stuff that made the apartment feel like mine. On a Wednesday, maybe 2 weeks after a week of too late work nights, I was drifting off when I heard a whisper scratch directly above my bed. At first I thought it was the pipes, because pipes sing and click in old buildings. But this was different, close, like a shoe scuffing slow in the attic. I held my breath and the sound stopped. I figured it was a mouse or a branch scraping the roof. I told myself that and nearly convinced myself of it. When I lay back down, though, it happened again, softer, like something tiny walking across the ceiling right above my head. I flipped the light on and pressed my ear to the mattress, trying to pin the noise with logic. The light showed nothing more than dust and shadows. The ceiling was a flat plane of popcorn plaster with no gaps or vents. Still, the scratches had a rhythm, deliberate and patient, as if whatever was up there was counting the ribs of the house. The next few nights, the small disturbances became a pattern. The steps returned around the time my eyes began to close, always starting at the lamp end of the bed and moving slowly toward my head. Sometimes it paused, then resumed with the same slow timing. I set traps of nonsense. An old shoe on the windowsill, a string of beads on the dresser, hoping if there were an animal it would knock something down and reveal itself. Each morning the string lay where I left it and the shoe rested obediently on the sill. The scratches were the only proof that anything had been there. I told my coworker about it half-jokingly, and he shrugged and said, "Old buildings have critters." That sounded plausible, except for one thing. The sound was too patient, like someone learning the map of my ceiling in tiny, polite steps. One night, after a day that stretched like chewing gum, I woke to a heavier movement. Not a scuff, but a deliberate pressure like someone running a fingertip sideways across plaster. I sat up, heart surprisingly calm, and stared at the ceiling as if I could watch it work. The fan bumped once and settled. The noise stopped for a breath, and then the room seemed suddenly full of attention, as if the ceiling itself had been listening for me. I grabbed my phone and held it flashlight up, sweeping the ceiling slowly as if a beam of light could catch what fingers could not. For a second, 3 heartbeats maybe, I thought I saw a shadow pass behind the plaster, a thin dark ribbon curling like smoke. Then nothing. I laughed a little, because what else was there to do? I told myself I was being childish, that this was my head making ghosts of noise. I fell back on the pillow and forced sleep like an assignment. The scratching grew bolder after that. It stopped being simply on the ceiling and started moving down the wall toward the headboard once. like it wanted to be closer. The next morning, I found faint marks on the wallpaper where something textured had rubbed against it. Tiny, perfectly round pits, arranged in no pattern I could read. They were too neat for an animal with claws and too small for my fingers. I ran a finger across one of the marks and felt a shallow roughness that suggested something had pressed into the paper hard enough to leave an imprint. I tried to shrug it off as a fluke, but when I lay down that night, the knowledge of those tiny circles made the sounds louder in my mind. I began to feel observed in a domestic way, not by a person peering through the blinds, but by something that knew exactly how I slept and chose those hours to move. To test it, I queued up my old voice recorder and left it under the pillow. The next morning, I played the file with my coffee and tried not to imagine more than what the clip offered. At 2:47 a.m., there was the softest shuffle, like paper dragging. At 2:59, a scraping that could have been a nail heading the wrong direction. And then, at 3:02, the strangest sound of all. A slow, wet tapping, as if tiny feet were parting a bead of water across plaster. The recording stopped for 5 seconds in the middle of that tapping. When the file resumed, there was a soft exhale, the sort of breath someone takes when they've reached the edge of something they don't intend to cross. I listened to it 3 times, and each time my hands shook a little. I replayed the part with the gap and tried to imagine an animal that could be so careful it knew when a recorder was watching. Nothing sensible fit. One evening, during the 3rd week of this, I woke to a crawling sensation on my forearm. It was light, like a spider brushing across skin, but when I flipped the lamp on the bed showed none of the usual culprits. My arm bore no bite, no hair stuck to it, only the sudden electric knowledge that something had passed along me. My breath hitched and I looked at the ceiling as if a face might reply. I moved my hand along the wall and felt a pattern. The tiny ring depressions repeated every few inches, as if whatever touched the plaster had a series of padded, round toes. I realized then the marks weren't random. They formed a trail that led from the corner of the room to directly above where my head lay. The hairs on my arms stood up in a way I'd only ever noticed in panic. I wanted to leave then, grab a bag, go to a friend's couch. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the ceiling until sunrise. The big moment, the one that made me stop saying, "probably animals," came without gore or shouting. It came as a small piece of proof. One morning, I found a tiny shell on the nightstand, no bigger than a fingernail, smooth and pale and improbably placed where my water glass sat. I had no idea where it came from. I cleaned it and held it between my fingers, and when I brought it close to my ear, it made a sound like distant rain. That night, I crawled into bed with the shell on my chest, daring whatever moved above me to leave something else. I woke at 3 to the faint pressure of something weighing down the blanket near my shoulder and lifted my hand. There was a smear of pale dust on my palm, like dried clay, and the shell was gone. I sat bolt upright and found a new line of tiny, wet circles tracing the seam where ceiling met wall, heading away from my bed. They led to the vent I had always thought useless and then stopped, as if whatever walked had chosen to leave the house through the air. There has never been a tidy resolution. I moved out for a while and lived in a place where the ceilings were high and smooth and boring. For weeks I slept without the nightly scuffs and the little ringed marks. Then one night I woke to the faint, familiar scratch and found a single pale shell on my bedside table, warm as if carried in a palm. The roof of my piece had been broken. Now I keep a small light on at night and a jar beside the bed where I drop anything that looks like evidence. A shell, a smudge, a single round depression in the plaster. The jar is ridiculous and comforting in equal measure. I've never been able to explain what crawled across my ceiling. An animal, a thing that learns a house like a map, or something else that prefers the time when people are least watchful. All I know is that it knows how I sleep, and that sometimes the quietest sounds are the most deliberate. Would you keep the jar of evidence or throw everything away and never sleep in that room again? Story 8. When I was 16, my cousin dared me to sleep in the spare room at my aunt's house. Everyone in the family called it the empty room because nobody used it. It was fully furnished. Bed, dresser, even curtains, but nobody ever went inside. I used to think it was just one of those family quirks, like how every aunt has one cabinet filled only with plastic bags. But that night, when the door closed behind me, I found out why no one wanted to sleep there. The room was alive. It breathed. The house itself was ordinary enough. A two-story place in the suburbs of Illinois with beige siding and wind chimes on the porch. We'd all gather there during summer because my aunt had a big backyard where the adults could barbecue while the kids played tag. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the floors creaked predictably, and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became the background noise of every evening. It was comforting in its own way. So when my cousin snickered, "Bet you can't last a night in the empty room," I laughed it off. It felt childish to be afraid of a bedroom with a queen mattress and floral wallpaper. I told myself it's just a room. The first hour wasn't bad. I lay in bed, scrolling through my phone, listening to the distant laughter of cousins still awake downstairs. The mattress was lumpy but not terrible, and the ceiling fan ticked with each turn like a metronome. I noticed the air felt different in there, heavier maybe, but I figured the vent wasn't working well. I set my phone aside, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and told myself I'd laugh about this in the morning. Then, just as my eyelids grew heavy, I heard it. A low, steady sound, like someone letting out a long breath. It wasn't the fan. It wasn't the house settling. It was the sound of lungs filling and emptying. I sat up quickly, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, tense, convincing myself I imagined it. Then it came again. Inhale, exhale, slow, heavy, as though the walls themselves were breathing. I wanted to run downstairs, but pride held me back. Instead, I lay down again, staring at the ceiling, trying to time the sound with my own breathing. That was the mistake, because after a few minutes, the breathing in the room started to change, longer, deeper, until it felt like the whole space was drawing air in and out. And worse, it wasn't in sync with me anymore. It was its own rhythm. I pulled the blanket tighter, whispering to myself that it was just the air vent. But when I glanced at the vent above the door, I realized it was sealed shut. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was organic. The curtains shifted slightly, as if stirred by something exhaling close to them. I sat up again, heart racing, but the room looked normal. Bed, dresser, chair by the corner. Ordinary. Except ordinary things shouldn't sound like lungs. Around midnight, the sound grew louder. I pressed my ear to the wall, and I swear I felt a vibration, like the pulse of something alive under the wallpaper. I scrambled back onto the bed, gripping the sheets, telling myself I just needed to last until morning. But then the breathing stopped. Complete silence. And that silence was worse, because it felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed something stranger. The air had changed. Every time I inhaled, it felt harder, like the oxygen was being stolen. My chest ached as though the room was taking more than its share, leaving me with scraps. I coughed, desperate for air, and in the corner of my vision, I saw the curtains ripple again. This time, the window was closed tight. I scrambled for my phone, the screen lighting up my face. It was 2:13 a.m. I opened the flashlight app and swept it across the room. That's when I saw it. The wallpaper wasn't smooth anymore. The floral patterns seemed to swell and sink, like skin stretching with each breath. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the headboard, unable to blink, because the wall itself looked alive. For a moment, I thought I heard something underneath the breathing. Whispers, faint and wet, like words forming underwater. I couldn't make out the language, but I knew they weren't friendly. The longer I stared, the more the patterns seemed to bulge, like hands pressing out from beneath the wallpaper, dragging in air with each inhale. I wanted to scream, but the air was too thin in my lungs. My vision blurred at the edges, and I thought I was going to pass out. Then, as suddenly as it began, the breathing quieted. The wallpaper smoothed out. The room went still. I sat there gasping, greedy for air, shaking so hard I dropped my phone. When I woke, sunlight streamed through the curtains. My phone lay on the floor, the flashlight still on. The walls looked normal. Too normal. At breakfast, my aunt asked if I slept well, and before I could answer, my cousin smirked. "Told you the empty room's weird." That smirk told me everything. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. To this day, I don't know if the room was suffocating me or trying to pull me into itself. I only know that I'll never, ever sleep in there again. Would you take the dare? Or would you tell your cousin to shut the door and never open it again?